The handwritten note waited for me on our kitchen island, casually placed next to a half-empty coffee mug, as if it were nothing more than a grocery list. I've found someone better. I'm filing for divorce and taking everything we've built. Don't bother fighting it. My lawyer says you won't win. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My husband. 15 years had reduced our entire marriage to 3 cruel sentences and vanished without even having the courage to face me. I stood there, my whole body trembling, as the words blurred through my tears. The morning sunlight streamed through our kitchen windows, illuminating the breakfast dishes I'd washed before my run, the children's school schedules magnetized to the refrigerator, the framed family photo from last summer's trip to Maine. Everything looked so normal, yet nothing would ever be the same. I reread Richard's note, my fingers tracing his hasty handwriting. The coffee in his abandoned mug was still warm. He must have left just minutes before I returned from my morning run, timed perfectly to avoid me. Classic Richard, always calculating, always one step ahead. Or so he thought. I sank onto one of our kitchen bar stools, the granite countertop cold against my arms. 15 years of marriage, 2 children we'd raised, a home we'd renovated room by room, and a business we'd built from nothing, all dismissed in 3 sentences on a torn sheet of notebook paper. My phone chimed with a text notification. It was Richard. I'll send someone for my things tomorrow. The house is on the market. Next week. No apology, no explanation, just more commands, more decisions he'd made without me, as if I were an afterthought in my own life. I looked around at our farmhouse kitchen with the custom cabinets I'd designed, the antique table where our family had shared thousands of meals. The idea that Richard could simply take it all, that he believed I would just crumble and accept it. Something shifted inside me. A strange calm settled over me, replacing the initial shock. I picked up my phone and typed a single response. Received your note. Thank you for the clarity. Then I called my sister. Lizzie? What's wrong? You never call this early, Maggie answered, concern evident in her voice. Richard's gone, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. He left a note saying, he's divorcing me and taking everything. He what? Maggie's outrage was immediate. That absolute, I need your help, I interrupted. Not with him, with me, with what comes next. There was a brief pause before Maggie responded, her tone shifting, from anger to determination. I'll be there in 30 minutes. My name is Eliza Warner, and at 42, I never imagined I'd be standing in my kitchen reading a goodbye note from the man who had promised to love me forever. I'm a landscape architect who built a thriving garden design business while raising our children and supporting Richard's career as a financial advisor. A career that had apparently given him the confidence to believe he could discard me and take everything we've built. What Richard didn't know, what he had never bothered to understand, was that I wasn't the same naive 27-year-old who had once believed his every promise. The woman who had helped him through graduate school, who had moved 3 times for his career advancements, who had built her business from scratch in each new city while raising our children. That woman had grown stronger with every challenge, more resourceful with every obstacle. While I waited for Maggie, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and took a long shower. The hot water washed away my tears, but not my resolve. By the time I heard Maggie's car in the driveway, I had changed into my favorite blue dress, the one Richard always said was too bold for everyday wear, and had pulled my hair back into a confident knot. Maggie entered without knocking, as she always did, arms laden with her laptop bag and what appeared to be legal pads. Let me see the note, she demanded, dropping her things on the kitchen table. I handed it to her silently, watching as her expression darkened. Typical Richard, she muttered. Always thought he was the smartest person in the room. She looked up at me. Are you okay? No, I admitted. But I will be. Maggie nodded, understanding in her eyes. As a corporate attorney, she'd seen her share of betrayals and power plays. Good, because we have work to do. She pulled out her laptop. First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. What joint accounts do you have? What's in your name only? What's in his? It's in his. I sat beside her, grateful for her practical approach. I'm not sure about everything. Richard always insisted on handling our finances. Of course he did, Maggie said dryly. Men like Richard thrive on controlling the money. It gives them power. She opened a spreadsheet. But that ends today. For the next 2 hours, Maggie and I combed through everything we could access: bank statements, property records, investment accounts. With each discovery, the picture became clearer, and with it, my understanding of just how meticulously Richard had been planning this. Large sums had been moved from our joint accounts over the past 8 months. Our investment portfolio had been significantly altered. And most alarmingly, there was a mortgage application in process for a luxury condo downtown, in Richard's name only. He's been planning this for at least a year, Maggie concluded, her voice tight with anger. Setting everything up so he could walk away with as much as possible. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it ignited something I hadn't felt in years, a fierce determination that burned through the fog of shock and grief. What about the business? I asked, thinking of Warner Landscapes, the company I'd built from nothing more than a passion for garden design and a single client 15 years ago. The company that now employed 12 people and had been featured in national magazines. According to these records, it's registered as a joint asset, Maggie said, frowning at her screen. But you're the sole operator, right? He never actually worked in the business? Never, I confirmed. He helped with some initial paperwork and financing, but everything else, the clients, the designs, the staff, that's all been me. Maggie made a note. That's important. And the house? We bought it together, but I managed the renovation. Every nail, every paint color, every fixture, I selected it all while Richard was busy building his client base. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. As we continued our inventory, my phone buzzed again with another text from Richard. My attorney will contact you tomorrow. Make this easy on yourself, Eliza. Maggie saw the message and raised an eyebrow. He really believes you'll just roll over, doesn't he? I placed my phone face down on the table. He always has. From the beginning, he's seen my accommodating nature as weakness, my willingness to compromise as submission. And now? Maggie asked, studying my face. I met her gaze steadily. Now I'm done accommodating. The doorbell rang, startling us both. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see a suited figure, tall, professionally dressed. That's fast, even for Richard, Maggie muttered, gathering her notes. Stay calm. Say nothing definitive. I'll be right here. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door to face the first messenger in what I already knew would be a war Richard never expected to fight. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to understand, was that I wasn't as naive as he thought. And he was about to learn exactly what I was capable of. I opened the door, expecting Richard's attorney. Instead, I found Jenna Patterson, our real estate agent, clutching a folder of papers and wearing an apologetic expression. Eliza, she began, her voice unnaturally bright. I'm so sorry to drop by unannounced, but Richard asked me to bring these listing documents by for your signature. He said it was urgent. I felt Maggie step up behind me, her presence solid and reassuring. Jenna, I said calmly, this is a surprise. Please come in. Jenna's gaze flicked between me and Maggie, clearly sensing the tension. She hesitated before stepping into the foyer, her professional smile faltering. The home she'd helped us purchase 7 years ago, the forever home Richard and I had promised each other, was now apparently on the chopping block without my knowledge. "Richard mentioned you'd be expecting these," she said, holding out the folder. "He's quite eager to get the house on the market by Monday." Maggie cleared her throat. "I'm Margaret Warner, Eliza's sister and attorney. I think there's been a misunderstanding." She gently took the folder from Jenna's hands. "No listing will be proceeding at this time." Jenna blinked rapidly. "But Richard was very clear that—" "Richard is not authorized to sell this property without my client's consent," Maggie interrupted, smoothly. "I suggest you contact him directly about this matter." I saw confusion and embarrassment wash over Jenna's face. I had no idea there was a dispute. Richard said you both agreed this was for the best." "Of course he did," I said softly. And, for a moment, despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy for Jenna. She wasn't the first person Richard had manipulated, and she certainly wouldn't be the last. After Jenna left, visibly flustered, Maggie turned to me with raised eyebrows. "Well, he's certainly moving fast." "He always does," I replied, leading her back to the kitchen. "Richard hates loose ends." As we resumed our work, I found myself staring at the family photos arranged on the built-in shelves, snapshots of a life that, until this morning, I had believed was fundamentally solid despite its flaws. There we were in front of the Eiffel Tower, Richard's arm draped around my shoulders. The four of us at Emma's high school graduation, Michael's 10th birthday party in the backyard, Richard manning the grill with his signature "World's Best." Dad, apron. When had it all become a facade? Or had it always been? "Tell me about you, Lizzie," Maggie said suddenly, interrupting my thoughts. "Not you and Richard, just you. I think we need to remember who Eliza Warner is, separate from being Richard's wife." I turned away from the photos. "I'm not sure I remember anymore." Maggie closed her laptop and fixed me with the intense stare that had intimidated opposing counsel for 20 years. "Try." I took a deep breath. Who was I? Before Richard? Before the children? Before the carefully curated life that was now unraveling around me? "I'm Eliza Warner. I'm 42 years old. I grew up in Silver Lake with you and Mom and Dad, climbing trees and designing elaborate gardens in the backyard with whatever plants I could convince Dad to buy. The memories came slowly at first, then faster. I studied landscape architecture at Berkeley, where I graduated top of my class despite everyone saying it wasn't a serious field." Maggie nodded encouragingly. "Keep going." "I can identify over 300 plants by their scientific names. I can tell what's wrong with a garden by the sound it makes in the wind. I built Warner Landscapes from nothing into a company that has designed spaces for celebrities and botanical gardens and ordinary people who just want a beautiful place to come home to." I stood up, pacing the kitchen, energy building in my voice. "I raised 2 amazing children while building that business. Emma is studying environmental science at Columbia because of the values I instilled in her. Michael is the most compassionate 16-year-old I know because I taught him that strength and sensitivity can coexist." The more I spoke, the more I remembered. Not just accomplishments, but qualities, strengths, the parts of myself that had receded as I'd gradually accommodated Richard's ever-expanding presence in our shared life. I'm patient, but persistent. I can envision a garden years before it matures and work steadily toward that vision. I can solve seemingly impossible design problems by approaching them from unexpected angles. I'm good with people. Clients trust me with their dreams because I listen, really listen to what they want. Maggie was smiling now. And I hate confrontation, I admitted, sinking back into my chair. I've always been the peacemaker, the compromiser, the one who smooths things over. Which is a strength, Maggie insisted. But it's also something Richard exploited. He knew you'd bend to keep the peace, so he kept pushing. I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. He once told me that my agreeableness was my most attractive quality. I laughed bitterly. Should have seen the red flag there. When did you start Warner Landscapes? Maggie asked, redirecting the conversation. Officially? About 2 years after we moved here for Richard's promotion, but I'd been designing gardens as a side job since college. I smiled, remembering those early days. My first paid job was redesigning Mrs. Holloway's disaster of a front yard, remember her? $300 and I was thrilled. And now? Now we handle projects with 6-figure budgets. We have corporate clients, municipal contracts, private estates. Pride crept into my voice. We're booked solid 8 months in advance. And Richard's role in the business is... I hesitated. He helped with the initial business registration. He's listed as co-owner because we were married and it seemed simpler at the time. He manages the taxes. I frowned, a new worry surfacing. At least he's supposed to. Maggie made another note. But the vision, the client relationships, the designs, the staff, that's all you? Every bit of it. Richard hasn't been to the office in years. He jokes about my plant hobby to his colleagues at the firm. The familiar sting of his dismissal felt different now. Less like shame and more like anger. So you built a thriving business that supports not just your family, but your employees' families too, all while Richard called it a hobby, Maggie summarized, her tone making it clear what she thought of that. Put that way, Richard's behavior seemed not just hurtful but absurd. I felt something shift inside me, a reconstruction of my self-image that had nothing to do with Richard's perception. What about the house? Maggie asked, gesturing to our surroundings. What about it? Who found it? Who renovated it? Who made it a home? I looked around at the space I'd poured so much of myself into. I found the listing. Richard thought it was too much work, but I saw the potential. I managed the entire renovation while he complained about the dust and the contractors and the cost. Every decision, from the layout changes to the paint colors to the garden design, was mine. He just wrote checks and criticized my choices, and then took credit when his colleagues came over for dinner parties, Maggie added shrewdly. I blinked, surprised by her accuracy. How did you know? Because I know Richard, and I know men like him. She sighed. They see their wives' work as an extension of themselves. Your success is his success, but your failures, those are all yours. The truth of her words settled heavily between us. All those times Richard had proudly shown off our home to his colleagues, accepting compliments for the design choices he'd initially opposed. The way he'd introduced me at company events as the woman behind the man, rather than as a successful business owner in my own right. What about the kids? Maggie asked gently. What about them? I said, instantly defensive. Whatever was happening between Richard and me, I was determined to shield Emma and Michael from the worst of it. Who raised them, Lizzie? Really raised? Them. The daily stuff. The hard stuff. I swallowed hard. I did. Richard traveled for work. A lot. Even when he was physically present, he was often absent, working, on his phone. I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge this particular hurt before. He never missed the big events, the recitals, the games, but the everyday moments, the homework struggles, the friend problems, the midnight fevers, that was all me. Maggie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm not trying to turn you against him. I'm trying to help you see clearly what you've built and what you've contributed. Because Richard is going to try to minimize all of it. He's going to try to make you doubt your own value. My phone buzzed again with another text from Richard. Jenna says you're being difficult. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I showed the message to Maggie, who rolled her eyes. Classic. You disagree with him once and you're being difficult. It's his favorite word for me, I admitted. That and emotional. Well, he hasn't seen difficult yet, Maggie said, a steely glint in her eye. But he's about to. As evening approached, we'd compiled a comprehensive inventory of our assets, our accounts, and our separate contributions to what Richard so casually called everything we've built. The picture that emerged was clear. I had contributed far more than I'd been giving myself credit for, and far more than Richard had ever acknowledged. I looked at the woman reflected in the darkening kitchen window. Straight-backed, clear-eyed, resolute, she looked stronger than I felt. But perhaps that was the real me, emerging from behind years of careful compromise and accommodation. "What happens now?" I asked Maggie as she packed up her laptop. "Now, we get you proper legal representation. I know family law isn't my specialty, but I know someone who's exceptional." She paused. "And we make sure Richard learns that leaving that note was the biggest mistake of his life." For the first time since finding Richard's cruel note that morning, I smiled, a genuine smile that felt like waking up after a long sleep. "I'd like that," I said. After Maggie left, promising to return the next morning with her colleague Patricia Reeves, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state, I found myself alone in the house that had, until this morning, been the center of our family life. The silence was oppressive. I wandered from room to room, seeing our history through new eyes, not just the beautiful spaces I'd created, but the relationship that had gradually deteriorated within these walls. When had things changed between Richard and me? Had there been warning signs I'd ignored? Or had I been willfully blind, so determined to maintain the appearance of a perfect life that I'd refused to see its hollow core? In our bedroom, I opened Richard's closet. Half of it was already empty, hangers dangling like abandoned punctuation marks. He must have been gradually moving his things out for weeks without me noticing. Or perhaps I had noticed, but dismissed, the empty spaces, making excuses for the disappearing pieces of him just as I'd made excuses for his absences at dinner or his distraction during conversations. On his nightstand sat the silver-framed photo from our wedding day. I picked it up, studying our younger selves, me in ivory lace, Richard in a classic black tuxedo, both of us radiant with hope and promise. We'd met at a charity gala in San Yai. Francisco when I was 27, newly graduated from my master's program and working for a prestigious landscape design firm. Richard, 5 years older and already establishing himself in financial services, had approached me at the bar with a confidence I found both intimidating and alluring. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," he'd said, sliding onto the stool beside me. I'd laughed, surprised by his accuracy. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to a fellow sufferer," he'd replied with a conspiratorial smile. "These events are necessary evils in my line of work. What's your excuse?" "My boss insisted I come. Something about networking and career advancement." I gestured to my simple black dress, clearly off the rack among a sea of designer gowns. "I'm not exactly blending in." "Thank God for that," Richard had said, his eyes warm with appreciation. "You're the only real person in this room." We'd talked for hours that night, abandoning the gala for a small jazz club nearby. Richard had been charming, attentive, genuinely interested in my passion for landscape architecture. He'd asked thoughtful questions about my designs, my philosophy, my dreams for the future. Unlike most men I'd dated, he didn't seem intimidated by my ambition or dismissive of my chosen field. Creating beauty in the world is the most important. "Work there is," he'd said, leaning close. "Anyone can make money. Not everyone can make magic." I placed the wedding photo face down on the nightstand. How quickly those appreciative words had transformed once we were married. The first time had been at a dinner with his colleagues, about a year after our wedding. "Eliza plays with plants," he'd said, with an indulgent smile when someone asked what I did. "It keeps her busy while I'm working." I'd corrected him gently later that night, reminding him that I was a professional with a master's degree, not a hobbyist. "Don't be so sensitive," he'd responded, loosening his tie. "It was just a joke." But it wasn't just once. Gradually, his description of my work shifted from creating beauty to her little business, to that garden stuff she does. Each time I objected, I was being too sensitive, or overreacting, or, his favorite, difficult. Still, there had been good times, great times even. Richard could be incredibly generous when he wanted to be. Surprise trips to Paris for our 5th anniversary. The vintage diamond bracelet he'd given me when I landed my first major corporate client. His unwavering support when my father died suddenly of a heart attack 8 years ago. We'd built a life together that looked perfect from the outside. Our wedding had been featured in a regional magazine. Our home renovation had been showcased in an architectural digest. Our children were accomplished and well-adjusted. We hosted dinner parties that our friends raved about for weeks afterward. We were, by all outward measures, living the dream. But somewhere along the way, the dream had developed hairline fractures. I moved to the kitchen and poured myself a glass. Of the expensive Cabernet, Richard always kept on hand for important guests, never clarifying who qualified as important enough for the good wine. Tonight, I decided I was important enough. Sipping the rich red wine, I tried to pinpoint when things had begun to change between us. There had been the incident 3 years ago, when Richard's firm merged with a larger company and he'd been passed over for the leadership position he'd expected. He'd come home that night radiating silent fury, brushing off my attempts at comfort. "You wouldn't understand," he'd said dismissively. "You've never operated at this level." That comment had stung, but I'd attributed it to his wounded pride and disappointment. Everyone says things they don't mean when they're hurting, don't they? But his dismissiveness had persisted long after the merger. Around the same time, I'd noticed him becoming more controlling about our finances. He'd always managed our money. That had been our arrangement from the beginning, a division of labor that had seemed logical given his expertise. But suddenly, he was questioning every purchase I made, requiring justification for business expenses, expressing concern about overspending, despite our comfortable financial situation. There had been the strange phone calls, too, conversations, that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The work emergencies that required immediate attention but couldn't be explained in any detail. The business trips that multiplied, stretching from weekends to full weeks, often with last-minute extensions. I'd asked him once, about 6 months ago, if everything was all right between us. If he was happy. "Of course I'm happy," he'd responded, barely looking up from his laptop. "Why wouldn't I be? We have everything we ever wanted." The easy confidence of his answer had reassured me, or at least convinced me to ignore the growing distance between us. Richard was just busy, stressed about work, going through a phase. Things would improve once his current project was complete, once the kids were back from college, once the summer holiday arrived. There was always a once hovering in our future, promising a return to connection that never quite materialized. I finished my wine and moved to Richard's home office, the one room in the house I hadn't designed or decorated. His domain, with its dark wood paneling and leather furniture, deliberately masculine in a way that had always felt like a declaration of separate territory. The drawers of his desk were mostly empty, files removed, computer gone. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of golf magazines, I found a small leather notebook I'd never seen before. I hesitated only briefly before opening it. Inside were notes in Richard's precise handwriting, reminders, appointments, calculations. Most seemed innocent enough until I reached entries from about 10 months ago. There, in Richard's unmistakable hand, was a list titled Exit Strategy. My hands trembled as I read through the methodical plan he'd created for leaving our marriage. Transfer investment portfolio to secure accounts, secure apartment downtown, remove personal items gradually, establish separate credit, consult with Stevens re business assets, minimize paper trail. The final item on the list sent a chill through me. Leave before she realizes. He'd planned it all, down to the last detail. While I'd been worrying about our disconnection, trying to find ways to bridge the growing gap between us, Richard had been systematically preparing to abandon our marriage, to take what he wanted, and leave me with nothing. The pain was physical, a crushing weight in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. But beneath the hurt, another emotion was taking shape, a cold, clarifying anger. This wasn't an impulsive decision. This wasn't a marriage that had simply run its course, with two people gradually growing apart. This was a calculated betrayal by the person I had trusted most in the world. I took the notebook and returned to the kitchen. There, I found my phone lit up with notifications, 3 missed calls from Emma, our 20-year-old daughter at college, and a text. "Mom, what's going on? Dad called and said you two are separating? Call me ASAP." My hands curled into fists. So Richard had already started controlling the narrative, presenting himself as the reasonable party while casting me as... What? The difficult wife? The emotional obstacle? The inconvenient detail in his carefully orchestrated new beginning? I called Emma immediately, my heart racing. She answered on the first ring. "Mom? Are you okay? What's happening?" I took a deep breath, determined to be honest without burdening my daughter with the ugliest details. "Your father and I are having some serious issues, sweetheart. He's decided to move on." "He said you're selling the house," Emma said, her voice small and confused. "He said I should come home this weekend to get anything I want to keep." The casual cruelty of it, using our daughter as another pawn in his game, ignited something fierce inside me. "The house isn't being sold," I said firmly. "This is your home, and it will continue to be your home. Your father has made some unilateral decisions that I don't agree with." There was a pause before Emma asked, "Did something happen? You guys seemed fine at Parents' Weekend last month. Had we?" I tried to recall our last family gathering through Emma's eyes. Richard and I standing together at the campus picnic, making small talk with her professors, taking the obligatory family photos by the university fountain. We'd performed our roles flawlessly, maintaining the appearance of unity while emotional continents shifted beneath the surface. "It's complicated, honey, and it's not something you need to worry about right now. I promise I'll tell you everything when the time is right." I hesitated, then added, "Just know that I love you and your brother more than anything, and that isn't going to change." After reassuring Emma and promising to keep her updated, I called Michael, who was staying at a friend's house for the weekend. Richard hadn't contacted him yet, which gave me a small window to prepare my son for the earthquake that was about to shake his world. Once both children had been spoken to, as honestly as I could manage while protecting them from the worst of it, I returned to the evidence of Richard's betrayal spread across the kitchen table. The notebook, the bank statements, the real estate listing forms he'd tried to have me sign. Tomorrow, with Maggie and Patricia's help, I would begin the formal process of fighting for what was rightfully mine. But tonight, in the quiet of the home I'd created, I allowed myself to fully feel the magnitude of Richard's deception and to kindle the small flame of determination that had been growing steadily since I'd first read his cruel note that morning. Richard had spent months orchestrating his exit, confident in my ignorance and passivity. He'd underestimated me in countless ways throughout our marriage, but this would be his last and greatest miscalculation. Because the woman he was leaving behind wasn't the same woman he'd married 15 years ago. That woman might have crumbled under the weight of his abandonment. That woman might have accepted whatever terms he dictated, desperate to avoid conflict and maintain peace at any cost. But that woman was gone, transformed by years of subtle dismissals and quiet strength, of building something beautiful while being told it didn't matter, of parenting alone while pretending we were a partnership. In her place stood someone Richard had never truly seen, someone he had never bothered to know, and she was ready to fight. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's exit strategy list, the methodical way he'd planned to dismantle our life together while I remained oblivious. I kept replaying moments from the past year, reinterpreting them through the lens of his betrayal. The weekend trips that had grown more frequent, the late nights at the office, the way he'd encouraged me to use my own credit card for business expenses for better record keeping. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but my mind was surprisingly clear. I showered, dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit I usually reserved for important client meetings, and made myself a strong cup of coffee. Today wasn't about comfort, it was about armor. Maggie arrived at 9 a.m. sharp with Patricia Reeves in tow. Patricia was everything I expected from Maggie's description. Impeccably dressed in a crimson suit, silver hair cut in a precise bob, piercing gray eyes that missed nothing. She radiated competence and a certain steely resolve that immediately put me at ease. "Eliza, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances," she said, her handshake firm and confident. "Maggie has briefed me on the situation. I'd like to hear your perspective now, if that's all right." For the next hour, I recounted everything: the note, the emptied closet, the financial discoveries, the exit strategy notebook, Richard's attempts to sell the house. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound notebook. When I finished, she closed her notebook and looked me straight in the eyes. "Based on what you've told me, your husband has been systematically preparing for this divorce for nearly a year, potentially hiding assets and attempting to manipulate the outcome to his advantage. Is that an accurate summary?" I nodded, the blunt assessment oddly comforting after months of gaslighting and dismissal. "Then we need to move quickly," Patricia continued. "First, we'll file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further transfer of assets or property. Then we'll request complete financial disclosure. From what you've discovered, there's potential evidence of financial misconduct, which the court takes very seriously." She outlined an initial strategy, her tone matter-of-fact, but not unkind. There would be immediate steps to secure my interests, followed by a comprehensive review of our finances, property, and business arrangements. The goal was to establish a clear picture of what we collectively owned and what contributions each of us had made. "What about the children?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. Emma and Michael might be older, 20 and 16, but they were still vulnerable, still caught in the crossfire of their father's actions. "We'll address their needs specifically," Patricia assured me. "Given their ages, custody isn't the primary issue, but continued support for their education and emotional well-being is crucial." As Patricia continued explaining the legal process ahead, my phone rang. Richard's name flashed on the screen. "Should I answer?" I asked, showing them the caller ID. Patricia and Maggie exchanged glances. "Put it on speaker," Patricia advised. "Answer calmly, say as little as possible, and don't make any agreements or concessions. We're here with you." I took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, Richard." "Eliza." His voice was controlled but with an undercurrent of irritation. "We need to talk about this situation like adults. Jenna tells me you refused to sign the listing agreement." "That's correct," I said, keeping my voice even. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," he sighed, the familiar note of condescension creeping in. "I knew you'd be emotional and difficult about this. That's why I thought it would be cleaner to handle things efficiently." "By efficiently, do you mean selling our house without my knowledge or consent?" I asked, surprising myself with my calm. There was a brief pause. "The house needs to be sold as part of our divorce settlement. You know that. You can't afford to maintain it on your own." "You don't know what I can afford, Richard," I replied. "You haven't known for quite some time." "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed. "I've managed our finances for 15 years. I know exactly what you can and cannot afford." Patricia nodded encouragingly as I continued. "Things have changed. I have legal representation now. Any communications about our assets should go through my attorney." "Attorney?" Richard's voice sharpened. Eliza, don't be dramatic. We don't need to involve lawyers and make this messier than it needs to be. Just sign the papers Jenna brought over and we can discuss a fair division of assets. I think we're past that point, I said quietly. You've been planning this for months, moving money, hiding assets. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're mistaken. I've always taken care of our family's financial interests. That's all I'm trying to do now. Ensure we both walk away with what's fair. Fair? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. Was it fair to make unilateral decisions about our life together? Was it fair to systematically drain our accounts while planning your exit? Was it fair to leave a note, Richard, ending 15 years of marriage? You're getting emotional, he said dismissively. This is why I chose to handle things this way. You're not thinking clearly. Something inside me shifted at those words, a tectonic plate finally breaking free after years of pressure. This wasn't just about the divorce or the money or even the cruel way he'd left. This was about years of being diminished, my thoughts, and feelings relegated to emotions that could be dismissed rather than valid perspectives deserving of respect. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. And what I think is that this conversation is over. My attorney will contact yours. Goodbye, Richard. I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or grief, from a strange, exhilarating sense of power. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I had set a boundary and held it firm. Well done, Patricia said with an approving nod. Very well done. He'll be furious, I said, already imagining Richard's reaction to being shut down so definitively. Good, Maggie replied with a grim smile. Angry people make mistakes. Patricia was already typing on her laptop. I'm drafting an emergency motion to freeze your joint assets. Given the evidence of his prior transfers, we have grounds for immediate action. As she worked, I wandered to the large windows overlooking the back garden. My garden, the space. I'd transformed from a barren lawn to a thriving landscape of native plants, flowering shrubs, and winding stone paths. I'd designed it to evolve through the seasons, to reveal new beauty with each passing month. Richard had complained about the initial investment, arguing for a simpler, less expensive approach. No one will notice all these details, Eliza, he'd said impatiently. It's just a backyard. But I had persisted, confident in my vision despite his doubts. And when the garden had been featured in a regional home magazine a year later, Richard had proudly shown the article to everyone who visited, as if the recognition somehow validated what had previously been just a backyard. That pattern had repeated throughout our marriage. My ideas dismissed until they proved successful, at which point they became joint achievements, or, increasingly, Richard's foresight. I always told Eliza this garden had potential, he'd say, conveniently, forgetting his initial skepticism. A memory surfaced suddenly, crystal clear despite being nearly a year old. We'd been hosting a dinner party for Richard's colleagues, a celebration of a major client he'd secured. As usual, I'd handled everything from the menu planning to the floral arrangements, ensuring every detail reflected well on Richard's professional image. During dinner, one of the partners' wives had complimented the house, particularly the sunroom we'd added during the renovation. It's absolutely stunning, she'd said. You must have had an incredible architect. Before I could respond, Richard had smiled smoothly. Actually, it was my idea. Eliza was worried about the cost, but I insisted it would add value to the property. I've always had a good eye for these things. It wasn't the first time he'd rewritten our history, claiming credit for decisions he'd initially opposed. Usually, I'd smile and remain silent, unwilling to contradict him publicly. But that night, something had shifted. Actually, I'd corrected gently, the sunroom was my design. Richard wanted to expand the garage instead. A brief, uncomfortable silence had fallen over the table. Richard's expression had hardened momentarily before he'd laughed, placing his hand over mine in a gesture that appeared affectionate, but felt like a warning. "Eliza loves to tease me about our renovation disagreements," he'd said smoothly. "We're quite the team, aren't we, darling? I handle the financial vision. She handles the aesthetic details." Later that night, after the guests had left, Richard had confronted me in the kitchen as I loaded the dishwasher. "What was that about at dinner?" he'd demanded, contradicting me in front of Julian. "I wasn't contradicting you," I'd replied, continuing to rinse glasses. "I was just clarifying who actually designed the sunroom." "It was unnecessary and embarrassing," he'd snapped. "These people are important to my career, Eliza. I need to appear competent and in control." "And does that require taking credit for my ideas?" I'd asked, finally turning to face him. His expression had shifted from anger to something more calculating. "Don't be so sensitive. It was just conversation, not a design credit application. Besides, I paid for the sunroom, didn't I? That makes it my project, too." I'd backed down then, as I always did, unwilling to escalate the conflict. But something had changed inside me. A small seed of recognition that had taken root and grown quietly over the months that followed. Now, staring out at the garden I'd created despite Richard's doubts, I recognized that moment for what it truly was. Not just a minor disagreement about dinner party conversation, but a glimpse of the fundamental imbalance in our relationship. Richard had never seen me as an equal partner with valid contributions. He'd seen me as an extension of himself, my accomplishments either minimized or appropriated to enhance his own image. "Eliza?" Maggie's voice brought me back to the present. "Patricia has some questions about the business structure." I turned away from the window, from the garden that represented so much of what I'd built and Richard had dismissed. As I rejoined the conversation with my sister and attorney, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The fog of self-doubt that had accumulated through countless subtle dismissals was finally lifting. "Before we continue," I said, pulling the leather notebook from my bag, "I think you should see this. It's Richard's planning journal. He's been orchestrating this for months." Patricia examined the notebook, her expression growing increasingly grave as she turned the pages. "This is unusually methodical," she said finally. "Most divorcing spouses don't create written evidence of their intentions to hide assets." "Richard has always been meticulous," I explained. "He documents everything. He probably never imagined I would find this." "Because he doesn't think you pay attention to the details," Maggie supplied, understanding in her eyes. Exactly. The realization settled over me like a revelation. He's always underestimated me, always assumed I was focused on the surface, the flowers, the decorations, the aesthetics, while he handled the important matters. "His mistake," Patricia said, closing the notebook carefully. "A significant mistake, as it happens. This kind of documentation gives us considerable leverage." As Patricia outlined our next steps, I felt something unexpected, a wave of gratitude toward Richard, not for the betrayal or the cruelty of his departure, but for the clarity his actions had forced upon me. For 15 years, I'd been slowly diminishing myself to accommodate his need for dominance, his narrative of superiority. I'd become so accustomed to the subtle erosion of my confidence that I'd stopped noticing it. Until today. Until the note that had been meant to destroy me instead became the catalyst for my awakening. "There's something else you should know," I said, interrupting Patricia's explanation of financial disclosure requirements. "The business, Warner Landscapes, it's more successful than Richard realizes." Patricia looked up from her notes, interest sharpening her gaze. "How so?" "Richard has always handled the taxes, the formal accounting. But about 3 years ago, when he became more controlling about our finances, I opened a separate business account. I hesitated, suddenly uncertain about the legality of what I'd done. I didn't hide it exactly. The account is in the business's name, but I never explicitly told Richard about it. "And what's in this account?" Patricia asked carefully. "Profits from our commercial contracts, design fees from the botanical garden project, revenue from the workshop series I started last year." I took a deep breath. "About $600,000. Maggie's eyes widened. "Lizzie, that's a significant sum," Patricia finished, her expression neutral. "And you've been maintaining this account for 3 years without your husband's knowledge?" I nodded, a flicker of worry creeping in. Was that illegal? I wasn't trying to hide assets. I was just protecting yourself, Patricia supplied. "No, it's not illegal, especially since the account is properly registered to the business entity. However, we'll need to disclose it now as part of the divorce proceedings." "Of course," I agreed quickly. "I want everything to be transparent." "The timing of when you establish this account will be important," Patricia continued. "You said it was about 3 years ago? Can you recall what prompted that decision?" I thought back, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I decided to create a financial safety net. It was after the merger at Richard's firm. He'd been passed over for the leadership position he expected, and he became different, more controlling. About money, more dismissive of my business. He started questioning every expense, suggesting I might need to scale back, despite our growing client list. I paused, another memory surfacing. There was one specific incident. I'd landed a major contract with Westridge Properties to design the landscapes for their new eco-friendly housing development. It was a huge opportunity, the kind of project that could elevate Warner Landscapes to a whole new level. When I told Richard, he barely looked up from his phone. "That's nice," he said, "but don't get too ambitious. You don't want to take on more than you can handle." The dismissal had stung, especially given how hard I'd worked to secure the contract. The next day, I opened the separate account and deposited the first payment from Westridge there. It wasn't about hiding money. It was about, claiming some part of my success for myself, having something that couldn't be diminished or controlled. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. That context helps. It shows you were responding to concerning behavior, not initiating deception. As our conversation continued as we mapped out strategies and timelines, I felt myself growing stronger with each passing hour. The woman who had trembled while reading Richard's cruel note that morning was receding, replaced by someone clearer-eyed and more determined than I'd been in years. Richard had intended his abrupt departure to leave me floundering, dependent, on his mercy for any financial security. Instead, he had inadvertently freed me from the constraints I'd accepted for too long. The awakening was painful, yes, but it was also powerful. Perhaps the most powerful moment of my adult life. By late afternoon, Patricia had filed an emergency motion to freeze our joint assets and formally notified Richard's attorney, a corporate lawyer named James Stevens, who, according to Patricia, was better suited to managing mergers than marriages. The initial paperwork had been submitted, and we'd scheduled a meeting with a forensic accountant for the following day. "Now?" Patricia said, closing her laptop with a decisive click. "Let's talk about your immediate plans. Richard's going to escalate when he receives these filings. Are you comfortable staying here alone?" I hadn't considered that aspect. I think so. Richard has never been physically threatening. People can surprise you when their control is threatened, Maggie pointed out gently. Maybe I should stay with you for a few days. I started to protest, then reconsidered. Having Maggie's support would be invaluable, not just for security, but for the emotional fortitude I'd need in the coming days. I'd appreciate that, I admitted. After Patricia left with promises to call the moment she heard anything, Maggie helped me secure the house. We changed the alarm code, checked all the locks, and Maggie even installed a small security camera at the front door. Just in case, she explained. As evening approached, Emma called again. "Dad's freaking out," she reported, her voice tight with worry. "He keeps saying you've gone nuclear and destroyed any chance of an amicable separation." "What's happening, Mom?" I sighed, wishing I could shield her entirely from the ugliness of the situation. "Your father made some unilateral decisions about our assets that needed to be addressed legally. I'm just protecting what's rightfully ours, including your home and college fund." "He says you're being vindictive," Emma said hesitantly, "that you're punishing him for wanting to be happy." The familiar pattern, Richard casting himself as the reasonable victim while painting me as emotional and irrational, ignited a fresh wave of anger. But I tempered my response, knowing Emma was caught in the middle. "I understand this is difficult and confusing," I said carefully. "Your father and I obviously have very different perspectives on what's happening. I promise I'll be as honest with you as I can be. But some of this involves complicated legal and financial matters that aren't appropriate to drag you into." After reassuring Emma as best I could, I turned to Maggie, frustration evident in my voice. "He's already trying to turn the kids against me, making me the villain." "It's predictable," Maggie replied, opening a bottle of wine. "He's losing control of the narrative. Of course he's going to try to rewrite the story with himself as the heroic figure seeking happiness and you as the vengeful shrew." "How do I fight that?" I asked, accepting the glass she offered. "I won't use my children as pawns." "By being consistent, by focusing on facts, not emotions, by showing them through your actions who you really are." Maggie raised her glass in a small toast. The truth has a way of revealing itself over time. I hoped she was right. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Richard's lawyer had responded to the emergency motion with predictable objections, but the judge had granted a temporary freeze on our major assets pending a full hearing. Richard himself had sent a series of increasingly angry texts, culminating, "Asik, you have no idea what you've done. This could have been simple. Now you'll regret making it complicated." I showed the message to Patricia when she arrived with the forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Chen, who carried a stack of file folders and exuded focused efficiency. "Textbook intimidation," Patricia observed, handing the phone back to me. "And not particularly creative. I suggest you stop responding directly and forward any communication to me." Diana set up her laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by the financial documents we'd gathered. "Mrs. Warner, I'll need access to all your accounts, personal and business, as well as any documentation of major assets, investments, properties, and significant purchases over the past 5 years. Please call me Eliza," I said, producing the files I'd prepared overnight. "And I've already started pulling everything together." Diana's eyebrows raised slightly as she surveyed my organized documentation. "Impressive. Most clients are less prepared." "Eliza has been underestimated." "For too long," Maggie said, squeezing my shoulder supportively. "That ends now." For the next several hours, Diana methodically reconstructed our financial history, tracing money flows, identifying discrepancies, and flagging suspicious transactions. Her occasional or interesting punctuated the steady click of her keyboard. "Your husband began restructuring your joint investments approximately 14 months ago," she noted, turning her screen toward us. "There's a pattern of liquidating certain assets and transferring funds through multiple accounts, likely attempting to obscure the trail." "Can you track where the money ultimately went?" Patricia asked. Diana nodded. "Most of it. He's established several new accounts primarily with offshore components, not particularly sophisticated methods, but designed to create enough complexity to discourage scrutiny." "He didn't think I'd look," I realized aloud. "He assumed I'd just accept whatever settlement he offered because I wouldn't understand the financial details." "A common miscalculation," Diana replied with a hint of satisfaction. What's less common is finding such clear documentation of intent. She gestured to Richard's notebook, which Patricia had photocopied and added to our growing evidence file. Most people don't write down their plans to hide marital assets. Very helpful of him. By late afternoon, we had a preliminary assessment. Richard had diverted approximately $1.2 million from our joint assets into accounts he controlled exclusively. He'd also attempted to change the ownership structure of his financial advisory practice to minimize its apparent value, a move Diana described as amateur hour in terms of asset concealment. What surprised me most was learning about the scale of our wealth. While I'd known we were financially comfortable, the true extent of our net worth had been obscured by Richard's careful control of information. Between the house, Richard's practice, my business, our investments, and retirement accounts, we had accumulated assets worth over $7 million. I had no idea, I admitted, staring at the figures Diana had compiled. He always made it seem like we needed to be careful with money. That my business expenses were stretching our budget. Financial control is about power, not necessity, Diana observed matter-of-factly. Now, let's talk about your business assets. Warner Landscapes shows consistent growth over the past 5 years, with a significant acceleration in the last 3. Your separate business account was a smart move, though it would have been better established with legal counsel's guidance. She turned to a new spreadsheet. Based on comparable businesses and standard valuation methods, Warner Landscapes is worth approximately $1.5 million as an ongoing enterprise, separate from its current cash holdings. Have you considered how you want to handle the business in the divorce settlement? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on defending what was mine that I hadn't thought about the proactive steps I could take. Patricia leaned forward. There are several options. Since you've been the primary operator despite the joint ownership on paper, we could argue for full business ownership as part of the settlement. Alternatively, we could negotiate a buyout of Richard's interest. I want full ownership, I said without hesitation. Warner Landscapes is my creation, my vision. Richard has never contributed anything beyond his name on some paperwork. That's a reasonable position, Patricia agreed. But be prepared for resistance. Men like Richard often fight hardest to retain control of what matters most to their wives. Not because they value it, but because it gives them leverage. I thought about that as Diana continued her analysis. Would Richard really fight for a business he'd repeatedly dismissed as my hobby? Then again, now that he knew its true value, perhaps he would see it differently. The thought of him trying to claim any part of what I'd built made my resolve harden further. What about the house? I asked Patricia. Richard seems determined to sell it. The house is currently valued at approximately $1.8 million with about $600,000 remaining on the mortgage, Diana supplied. It's titled jointly, but your documentation shows you managed the entire renovation and have been handling the mortgage payments directly from your business account for the past 3 years. Another smart move, Patricia noted. Your consistent payment history strengthens your claim to the property. If you want to keep the house, we'll make that a priority in our strategy. I gazed around the kitchen, at the custom cabinetry I'd designed, the garden visible through the windows, the memories embedded in every corner. This wasn't just a valuable asset. It was my home, my children's home, the space I'd poured my creativity and love into for years. Yes, I said firmly. I want to keep the house. Patricia made a note. Then we'll build our case accordingly. Now let's discuss your immediate financial needs. The asset freeze protects your long-term interests, but we need to ensure you have operating capital in the meantime. We established a plan for managing household and business expenses during the divorce proceedings, with Diana providing specific guidance on documentation and account management. By the time they left that evening, I had a comprehensive understanding of our financial situation and a clear strategy for moving forward. Maggie, who had observed most of the day's discussions quietly, handed me a glass of wine as we sat on the patio watching the sunset. "How are you feeling?" I considered the question carefully. Stronger, clearer, and, this is strange, almost grateful. Grateful? Maggie's eyebrows rose. If Richard hadn't been so arrogant, so dismissive, I might never have discovered what he was doing. His confidence in my ignorance was his downfall. I sipped my wine thoughtfully. He thought leaving that note would devastate me. Instead, it woke me up. Maggie smiled. There's a certain poetic justice in that. The next morning, I woke with renewed purpose. While Maggie made coffee, I went to my home office and turned on my computer. There, I created a new document titled Moving Forward and began listing immediate actions I needed to take. 1. Contact key Warner Landscapes clients to reassure them about business continuity. 2. Schedule meetings with my team to explain the situation, appropriately. Secure business records and back up all digital files. 4. Review insurance policies and update beneficiaries. Change passwords on all personal accounts. Check in with Michael and Emma daily. 7. Begin gathering documentation of my contributions to the house and business. The act of planning, of taking concrete steps to secure my future, felt empowering. For too long, I'd allowed Richard to dictate the terms of our life together. Now, I was reclaiming control, not just of my assets, but of my narrative. I was halfway through calling my project managers when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera Maggie had installed, I could see Richard standing on the porch, radiating impatience in his perfectly tailored suit. "Don't answer it," Maggie advised, appearing at my side. "You're not obligated to speak with him, in person." Patricia was very clear about that. "I know," I said, watching Richard's agitated movements on the small screen. "But I'm not afraid of him anymore." I opened the door but remained in the threshold, blocking entry. "Richard, this is unexpected." His expression was a mixture of anger and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that his carefully laid plans had gone awry. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Eliza? An emergency asset freeze? A forensic accountant? This is completely unnecessary and excessive." "Is it?" I kept my voice calm, remembering Patricia's advice to remain factual and unemotional. "You transferred $1.2 million out of our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent. You attempted to sell our house without consulting me. You left a note, Richard, ending our marriage and threatening to take everything. What exactly did you expect my response would be?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. "I expected you to be reasonable, to understand that a clean break is better for everyone, not to go nuclear and bring in attack dog lawyers. You planned your exit for nearly a year," I said, the knowledge still stinging despite my outward composure. "You systematically moved assets, established separate accounts, and prepared to leave me with as little as possible. And you documented it all in that little leather notebook you kept in your desk." Richard's face went pale. "You had no right to go through my private things." "And you had no right to steal from our marriage?" I countered. "But here we are." He changed tactics, his expression softening into the persuasive look that had convinced countless clients to trust him with their finances. "Lizzie, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We can still work this out reasonably between ourselves. All this legal maneuvering is just going to drain our resources and hurt the kids." The use of my nickname, the one only my closest family used, felt like another violation. "Don't call me that, and don't pretend to be concerned about resources after what you've done. As for the children, you should have thought about them before you decided to end our marriage with a note and a text message." Richard's facade of reasonableness cracked, anger flashing in his eyes. "You're making a mistake. I was willing to. Be generous, but if you want to fight, I'll fight. And I'll win. I always win, Eliza. You know that." I studied the man I'd been married to for 15 years, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. His confidence, once attractive, now revealed itself as arrogance. His decisiveness, once reassuring, showed itself as controlling. The qualities I'd admired had become the weapons he'd used to diminish me. "No, Richard," I said quietly. "Not this time. This time you've already lost. You just don't know it yet." I closed the door on his startled expression, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. Through the window, I watched him stand there for several moments, seemingly unable to process what had just happened. Finally, he turned and walked back to his car, his normally confident stride slightly less certain. Maggie appeared beside me, pride evident in her expression. "Well done. Very well done." I took a deep breath, surprised by my own steadiness. I've spent 15 years accommodating his ego, smoothing over his demands, accepting his dismissals. No more. As Richard's car pulled away, I returned to my office and added one more item to my moving forward list. Remember who I am without him. The strategic response I'd begun wasn't just about protecting assets or securing a fair settlement. It was about reclaiming my power, my confidence, and my future. Richard had intended to leave me with nothing. Instead, he'd inadvertently given me the one thing I'd been missing for years, the clarity to see my own strength. 3 weeks after finding Richard's note, I sat across from him in a conference room at Patricia's law firm, preparing for our first formal mediation session. The polished mahogany table between us seemed to stretch for miles, though in reality, only a few feet separated us. Richard wore his power suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, his closing the deal attire. I'd chosen a forest green dress that Richard had always claimed was too bold for business settings. Patricia sat beside me, composed and meticulous in her preparation. Richard had brought James Stevens, the corporate attorney, and added a divorce specialist named Martin Green, whose reputation for aggressive tactics had earned him the nickname the Bulldozer among local legal circles. "Adding firepower, I see," Patricia had murmured when we entered the room. "He's worried." The mediator, a retired judge named Eleanor Wright, began by outlining the process and reminding everyone that the goal was to reach a fair settlement without proceeding to litigation. "Divorce is difficult enough without turning it into a protracted legal battle," she observed, her experienced gaze moving between Richard and me. "I encourage both parties to approach these discussions with flexibility and good faith." Richard nodded solemnly, the picture of reasonable cooperation. I recognized the performance, the same one he gave prospective clients who were on the fence about trusting him with their life savings. His "you can count on me" expression that had once seemed so reassuring now struck me as calculated and hollow. The initial discussions focused on straightforward matters, confirming our assets, establishing temporary support arrangements, addressing immediate concerns about household expenses and business operations. Throughout this phase, Richard maintained his composure, though I noticed a tightness around his mouth whenever his financial maneuvering was referenced. The real tension emerged when we turned to Warner Landscapes. "Our position is that Mrs. Warner should retain full ownership of the business," Patricia stated firmly. "She has been the sole operator and creative force behind its success. Mr. Warner's involvement has been minimal and primarily administrative." Martin Green leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "The business was established during the marriage with marital funds. Mr. Warner provided the initial capital investment and has managed the tax and financial aspects throughout its existence. The success of Warner Landscapes is the result of a partnership, and my client is entitled to his fair share of this marital asset." I felt a flare of indignation at this characterization, but Patricia had prepared me for this moment. I kept my expression neutral, even as my hands tightened in my lap beneath the table. Patricia smiled thinly. "Let's be precise about Mr. Warner's contributions, shall we? The initial investment was $25,000 from joint savings, savings that included Mrs. Warner's earnings from her previous employment. As for managing tax and financial aspects, our forensic accounting shows that Mr. Warner's involvement consisted primarily of filing annual tax returns, a service that could have been purchased for approximately $2,500 per year. She slid a folder across the table. What this doesn't account for is Mrs. Warner's 70-hour work weeks building the company, her master's degree in landscape architecture that qualified her to secure prestigious contracts, or her industry reputation that attracts high-value clients. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'd seen that expression before, when a negotiation wasn't going his way, when someone challenged his authority. It was the look that usually preceded him taking control of a situation, asserting his dominance. "This isn't about credentials or hours worked," Martin countered. "This is about a business built during a marriage with shared resources and shared risk." Mr. Warner's financial expertise and business connections were instrumental in establishing and growing Warner Landscapes. Without his support and financial management, the business wouldn't exist in its current form. I couldn't remain silent any longer. "That's simply not true," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Richard has barely set foot in the Warner Landscapes office in the past 5 years. He has no relationship with our clients, no understanding of our design process, and no involvement in day-to-day operations. His business connections brought in exactly one client in 15 years, his golf partner who needed his backyard redesigned." Richard's expression darkened. "I've supported your little business from the beginning, Eliza. I handled the incorporation, the banking relationships, the tax planning, all the boring financial details you never wanted to deal with. Just because I wasn't playing in the dirt doesn't mean I wasn't contributing. The dismissive reference to playing in the dirt, his longtime characterization of my professional work, ignited something inside me. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. "Is that how you view landscape architecture, Richard? Playing? In the dirt? That little business you've been so dismissive of generates annual revenues of over $2 million. My playing in the dirt paid for our children's private school tuition, the vacation home in Tahoe, and, for the past 3 years, our mortgage." Richard scoffed. "Now you're just being dramatic. I've always been the primary breadwinner in our family." "Actually," Patricia interjected smoothly, "the financial records tell a different story." She nodded to Judge Wright. "If I may present Exhibit 14. The mediator nodded, and Patricia distributed copies of a detailed financial analysis. This comparison of household contributions shows that over the past 5 years, Mrs. Warner's business has contributed 58% of the family's living expenses, not including individual retirement savings or investment activities. Richard looked, genuinely startled, glancing at his attorneys with confusion. James Stevens leaned over to whisper something in his ear while examining the documents with a frown. Furthermore, Patricia continued, Mrs. Warner's separate business account, which she established 3 years ago in response to Mr. Warner's increasingly controlling behavior regarding finances, contains significant business profits that he was unaware of. This is not because Mrs. Warner was hiding assets, but because Mr. Warner demonstrated such consistent disinterest in her business that he never bothered to inquire about its true performance. Martin Green's expression hardened. The existence of this separate account raises serious concerns about Mrs. Warner's transparency and good faith in the marriage. Does it? Patricia countered. Or does it raise concerns about Mr. Warner's dismissive attitude toward his wife's professional success? The account was properly established in the business's name, with appropriate corporate documentation. All taxes were filed correctly. Mrs. Warner simply managed her growing business prudently, something her husband might have noticed had he viewed her work as anything more than a hobby. The mediator interjected, her tone measured. Let's focus on solutions rather than accusations. Mr. Green, what is your client proposing regarding Warner Landscapes? Martin consulted briefly with Richard before responding. Given the significant value of the business, my client proposes either a 50-50 ownership split moving forward or a buyout of his interest at fair market value. That's not acceptable, I said immediately. Patricia touched my arm gently, a reminder to let her handle the negotiation, but I pressed on. Richard has never valued my business until this moment, when he realizes it's worth something. Now suddenly, he wants half of what I've built, after years of dismissing it? Richard leaned forward, his composure slipping. You built it with my support, in my house, using my connections. You wouldn't have had the luxury to follow your passion if I hadn't been supporting our family. But you weren't, I replied, gesturing to the financial analysis. Not for years. You've been living on my success while convincing yourself, and me, that it was the other way around. Richard's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. I won't be painted as some kind of parasite. I worked 60-hour weeks building my practice while you were arranging flowers and drawing garden sketches. The contempt in his voice silenced the room. Even his own attorneys looked uncomfortable with his characterization of my professional work. The mediator's expression remained neutral, but her gaze sharpened as she observed our exchange. This was the moment, the unguarded flash of Richard's true perspective, the mask of reasonableness slipping to reveal the condescension beneath. For years I'd tolerated these dismissals, made excuses for them, diminished myself to accommodate his need to feel superior. But not anymore. Judge Wright, I said, addressing the mediator directly, I've spent 15 years of marriage having my professional accomplishments minimized and dismissed by my husband. I've built Warner Landscapes from nothing into a company that employs 12 people, has won national design awards, and supports our family financially. I've done this despite, not because of, Richard's support. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I am prepared to negotiate fairly on all our marital assets. I am prepared to divide our investments, our properties, and our savings in an equitable way. But Warner Landscapes is non-negotiable. It's my creation, my passion, and my future. I will not allow it to become another battleground for control. Richard snorted dismissively. You don't get to unilaterally decide what's negotiable in our divorce, Eliza. Actually, Patricia intervened, we have another perspective to offer. She removed a document from her briefcase and passed copies to Richard's attorneys and the mediator. This is an affidavit from Thomas Reynolds, your personal attorney who handled the original business formation documents for Warner Landscapes. Richard's expression shifted from contempt to wariness as Patricia continued. Mr. Reynolds confirms that when establishing the business, he specifically advised Mr. Warner that both spouses should be listed as owners for tax purposes, but that a separate operating agreement should clarify actual management rights and ownership interests. Mr. Warner declined to create this operating agreement, stating, and I quote, "It's just her little garden business. It doesn't need all that legal mumbo-jumbo." Patricia tapped the document. This demonstrates that from the very beginning, Mr. Warner viewed Warner Landscapes as Mrs. Warner's separate endeavor, not a joint enterprise. His dismissive attitude has actually created a legal foundation for our position that the business should remain with its creator and operator. A tense silence fell over the room. Richard stared at the affidavit, then at his attorneys, who were whispering urgently. The mediator reviewed the document with careful attention. Additionally, Patricia continued, we have documentation of numerous instances where Mr. Warner publicly characterized the business as my wife's hobby or her little garden project, further establishing his historical view of Warner Landscapes as Mrs. Warner's separate interest. Martin Green cleared his throat. Judge Wright, we'd like to request a brief recess to review this new information with our client. Of course, the mediator agreed. Let's reconvene in 20 minutes. As Richard and his attorneys filed out, Patricia squeezed my hand beneath the table. "That was the turning point," she whispered. "Reynolds's affidavit changes everything. Richard's consistent dismissal of your business has inadvertently strengthened our position that it should remain solely yours." In the empty conference room, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Richard's contempt for my work, the very thing that had hurt me throughout our marriage, was now working in my favor legally. There was a certain poetic justice in that, though the pain of his dismissal remained. When everyone returned, Richard's demeanor had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by a guarded tension. Martin Green addressed the mediator with measured control. "After consulting with our client, we're prepared to revise our position on Warner Landscapes. Mr. Warner will relinquish claims to the business in exchange for adjustments to the division of other marital assets." It was happening. The business I'd built, the creation Richard had dismissed for years, would remain mine. I felt a rush of emotion, relief, triumph, vindication, but maintained my composure as Patricia and Richard's attorneys began negotiating the details of this significant concession. As the legal teams worked through the implications, I caught Richard watching me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, resentment, perhaps even a reluctant respect. Our eyes met briefly across the table, and in that moment, I realized something important had shifted, not just in our legal proceedings, but in the fundamental power dynamic between us. For the first time in our relationship, Richard was seeing me clearly. Not as an extension of himself, not as the supportive wife who arranged flowers and drew garden sketches, but as a formidable businesswoman who had built something valuable despite his dismissal. It was, without question, the turning point in our divorce and in my reclamation of self-worth. The weeks following the mediation session brought rapid changes. Richard's concession regarding Warner Landscapes broke the dam of resistance, and the remaining negotiations, while not easy, progressed with a momentum that surprised everyone involved. Patricia was relentless, using Richard's documented attempts to hide assets as leverage to secure favorable terms on nearly every front. Diana Chen's forensic accounting had uncovered additional transfers that even Richard's attorneys couldn't explain away, weakening his position further. He's realizing that fighting us is more costly, financially and reputationally, than settling fairly, Patricia explained after a particularly productive negotiation session. Financial advisors can't afford public scandals about mishandling money, especially their own. By the 2-month mark, we had reached a comprehensive settlement agreement. I would keep the house outright, with Richard receiving a slightly larger portion of our investment portfolio to offset its value. Warner Landscapes remained entirely mine, while Richard retained full ownership of his financial advisory practice. Our retirement accounts would be split 50-50, and the vacation property in Tahoe would be sold, with the proceeds divided equally. Most importantly, Richard would return the $1.2 million he had diverted from our joint accounts, with an additional penalty payment to cover the legal and accounting expenses his actions had necessitated. "This is an exceptional outcome," Patricia told me the day we reviewed the final settlement documents. "Much better than most clients achieve, especially in high-conflict situations." "I couldn't have done it without your expertise," I said sincerely. "Or without Diana's forensic skills." Patricia smiled, but shook her head slightly. "Those were just tools, Eliza. The real difference was your preparation and documentation, and your willingness to stand firm when it mattered. Most clients either cave under pressure or become so consumed by anger that they sabotage their own interests. You did neither." The day we signed the settlement papers was surreal. Richard and I sat at opposite ends of the conference table, our attorneys flanking us, the mediator presiding with professional detachment. We signed document after document, transferring assets, dividing the life we'd built together into distinct separate parts. Richard looked diminished somehow. The confident, commanding presence that had once dominated rooms now seemed muted, contained. He avoided my gaze as we worked through the paperwork, speaking only when necessary and in clipped formal tones. As we reached the final documents, Judge Wright addressed us both. Before we conclude, I want to acknowledge that legal resolutions, even favorable ones, rarely address the emotional aspects of divorce. I encourage both of you to seek whatever support you need as you move forward separately. Richard nodded, stiffly. I murmured a quiet, "Thank you," appreciating her recognition of the human dimension beneath the legal proceedings. When the signing was complete, Richard stood abruptly. "Is that everything?" he asked his attorney, clearly eager to leave. "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "could we have a moment alone?" I glanced at Patricia, who raised an eyebrow but nodded slightly. Richard hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine." As the others filed out, promising to return in 5 minutes, an awkward silence settled between us. Richard stood near the window, hands in his pockets, radiating discomfort. "What do you want, Eliza?" he finally asked. I studied him. This man I'd shared my life with for 15 years, the father of my children, once the center of my world. "I want to understand," I said simply. "Why the note? After 15 years, why end our marriage with 3 cruel sentences and a plan to take everything?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Does it matter now? It's done." "It matters to me," I replied. "Not for the legal proceedings, not for negotiation leverage, just for closure, I suppose." He was silent for so long I thought he might refuse to answer. Then he sighed, seeming to deflate slightly. "I thought it would be easier, cleaner. No messy conversations, no arguments, no tears, just finished." "Easier for whom? You?" "For both of us," he insisted, but his eyes slid away from mine. "You've never handled conflict well, Eliza. You get emotional, you compromise to keep the peace. I thought—" He trailed off. "You thought I'd just accept." "Whatever you decided," I finished for him, "that I'd be too overwhelmed to fight back." A flush crept up his neck. "I underestimated you," he admitted grudgingly. "I didn't realize you'd become so formidable." "I've always been formidable, Richard. You just never bothered to notice." He made a dismissive gesture, a shadow of his old arrogance surfacing. "Let's not rewrite history. You were different when we met. Softer, more accommodating. This version of you?" He gestured vaguely in my direction. "This is new." "No," I said quietly. "This isn't new. This is who I've always been beneath the accommodations I made for your ego. The woman who built a business while raising your children. The woman who renovated our home while you complained about the dust. The woman who kept showing up even when you stopped seeing her." Richard's expression shifted, something almost like regret flickering across his features. "Maybe," he conceded. "Maybe I didn't see a lot of things. Including the value of what you were throwing away," I added, not unkindly. He didn't respond to that, just looked out the window at the city skyline. After a moment, he asked, "How are the kids handling everything?" "They're hurt and confused," I answered honestly. "Emma's angry with you. Michael is trying to pretend he's fine, but he's struggling. They need their father, Richard. Not just financial support, but actual presence." "I'm not good at that part," he said, an unexpected vulnerability in his voice. "The emotional stuff. Never have been." "You could learn," I suggested. "They're worth the effort." He nodded slowly. "I know." Then, after a pause, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the note. It was cowardly. It wasn't a complete apology. Not for the betrayal, the financial deception, the years of dismissal. But it was something. An acknowledgement, at least, that his actions had caused pain." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. When Patricia and the others returned, Richard and I had said all we needed to say. We gathered our respective copies of the settlement documents and prepared to leave, not as husband and wife, but as two individuals with separate paths forward. At the elevator, Richard hesitated, then extended his hand formally. "Good luck, Eliza." I accepted the gesture, this final professional courtesy that seemed fitting for the man who had always valued business transactions over emotional connections. "You too, Richard." And that was it. The external resolution of 15 years of marriage, completed with signatures and handshakes and the ding of an elevator arriving. I drove home, to my home now, legally and completely, in a state of stunned clarity. It was over. The house was mine. The business was mine. My financial security was intact, even enhanced by the settlement terms Patricia had negotiated. Richard had left that cruel note intending to destroy me, to strip me of everything we'd built together. Instead, I had emerged with more than I'd ever had within the confines of our marriage. Not just material assets, but confidence, agency, and a profound understanding of my own resilience. When I arrived home, Maggie was waiting with champagne, and Emma, who had driven in from college to celebrate the settlement signing. "To Mom, the warrior," Emma toasted, raising her glass with fierce pride. At 20, she had watched the entire process with an awareness that both concerned and impressed me. "And to sweet, sweet justice. To new beginnings," Maggie added, clinking her glass against mine. I looked around my kitchen, the space where I'd found Richard's note just 2 months earlier, where my world had seemingly collapsed and then reconstructed itself into something stronger. "To unexpected gifts," I said softly, "even the painful ones." Later that evening, after Emma had returned to campus and Maggie had gone home, I wandered through the quiet house, truly alone for the first time since the divorce process began. In the master bathroom, I noticed Richard's monogrammed towels, still hanging on their hooks, artifacts from a life no longer in progress. I gathered them up, along with other remnants of his presence, a forgotten razor, expensive cologne, the sleep mask he used on business trips. These items that had once been integrated into the landscape of my daily life now seemed like artifacts from a museum exhibit. Marriage, early 21st century, artifacts of absence. In the garden, I built a small fire in the copper pit we'd installed last summer. One by one, I added Richard's forgotten items, watching as the flames consumed these last physical traces of our marriage. It wasn't rage driving this ritual, but something more nuanced, a ceremonial release, a cleansing, a conscious choice to move forward unburdened. As the fire burned down to embers, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Patricia, confirming that all settlement documents had been properly filed with the court. Her message ended with a simple but powerful affirmation. "Congratulations, Eliza. You've secured your future on your own terms." My own terms. The phrase resonated deeply. For years, I'd lived according to Richard's terms, his expectations, his priorities, his dismissals. Now, the external structures of my life, my home, my business, my finances, were aligned with my own values and vision. The practical matters were resolved. The legal battle was won. The external landscape of my life had been reconfigured, boundaries reestablished, assets secured. But as I watched the last embers fade in the fire pit, I knew that the internal journey, the emotional reconciliation with betrayal, the reclamation of self after years of subtle erosion, was only beginning. The external resolution provided security and vindication. It was the foundation upon which I could now build a new life. But the architecture of that life, its purpose, its meaning, its emotional texture, would be the work of days and months and years to come. I extinguished the embers with water from the garden hose, watching the steam rise into the night air. Then I went inside, locked the doors of my house, and began to imagine what tomorrow might look like on my own terms. 1 year after, finding Richard's note on my kitchen counter, I stood in the same spot, morning light streaming through windows that now had curtains in colors Richard would have deemed too bold. The house felt different, lighter, more vibrant, more authentically mine. Warner Landscapes had not only survived the divorce but thrived, expanding into conservation projects and educational workshops. The business Richard had dismissed as a hobby now employed 15 people and had been featured in national design publications. The most profound changes, however, were internal. The woman who had trembled reading those cruel words a year ago had transformed into someone stronger, clearer, and more confident. Someone who recognized her own worth without needing external validation. I no longer flinched when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I no longer doubted my business decisions or apologized for my success. I had learned to parent my children independently, to make choices without second-guessing myself, to claim space unapologetically. There had been difficult moments, of course. Days when single parenthood felt overwhelming, when loneliness crept in, when the magnitude of rebuilding a life from scratch seemed impossible. But those challenges had revealed capacities I hadn't known I possessed. Resilience, resourcefulness, and a deep well of strength that had always existed beneath the accommodations I'd made for Richard's ego. 3 months ago, I'd received a surprising email from Richard requesting a meeting. We met at a neutral cafe where he arrived looking somehow diminished, his confident swagger replaced by something more tentative. "I've been doing some thinking," he said after awkward small, "some therapy, actually." He smiled wryly at my raised eyebrows. "I know, surprising, but I've realized some things about how I treated you, about the marriage. I wasn't fair to you, Eliza. I didn't see you. Not really. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was an acknowledgement. And strangely, I found I didn't need more than that. The validation I'd once craved from him now seemed irrelevant compared to the self-acceptance I'd cultivated. "Thank you for saying that," I replied simply. As I placed the anniversary card from my team on the refrigerator, celebrating 1 year of Warner Landscapes 2.0, as they called it, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had begun with devastation and led to this moment of quiet triumph. The note Richard had left intending to destroy me had instead catalyzed my awakening. The cruel words meant to diminish me had ultimately led to my expansion. The man who had planned to take everything had inadvertently given me the most precious gift, the rediscovery of my own worth. I ran my fingers over the business card I now carried, redesigned after the divorce, with Eliza Warner, founder and principal designer, printed in confident letters. No diminishment, no qualification, no deference to anyone else's vision. Just me, standing in my power, finally taking up the space I deserved. That morning, looking at what I'd built from the ashes of betrayal, I realized that Richard's note hadn't been an ending after all. It had been the beginning I never knew I needed.